Martin, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
So, very excited to bring you on because you are an expert in the field of planning, Martin. So this is quite unusual for us on the podcast. Often we do bring a lot of guests on, but a lot of our guests are often investors investing in HMO properties themselves, maybe friends within my network online. But in your case, it's a little bit different, and it's possible that not everybody, not all of our listeners know who you are. So before we dive in, and I've got some questions I'm dying to ask you today because this is a big topic. Can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, Martin.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm a town planner. I worked for years in local councils around London. So I was in town halls, deciding planning applications, helping applicants and all of that. I left in 2013 and I set up a small consultancy, Just Planning, and we help homeowners and smaller developers with planning problems. Basically, we do kind of troubleshooting rather than all everyday applications. We try and get involved where people have run into trouble. And in the last kind of 5 years, I suppose, there's been a massive increase in the amount of our work that relates to HMOs. So when I worked at the councils, it rarely came up. I don't think I ever dealt with an application for a new HMO, even though I was in London, where it's kind of a big issue now. And then suddenly out of the blue, there was a kind of an increasing snowball effect. More and more people were calling up and saying, I've had an enforcement notice, or the council have turned up and they say I need planning, but I have a license. Why do I need planning? And there was this kind of confusion and just a kind of a exponential increase in planning work for HMOs. So I got involved in that kind of sector. I've just written a book on planning for HMOs, which is out early next year. And I thought it might be interesting to chat to you about this whole area.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so uncanny, the timing, Martin, because listeners of the show will know that only in the last few weeks, I'm buying another HMO at the minute. It's an existing HMO. It's in an Article 4 direction, actually a recently introduced Article 4 direction, but nevertheless, was existing and being used as a HMO before it came in. And my solicitors and then the planners who then got involved on the request of my solicitors have got themselves into a bit of a tiz about the status and the planning status. And actually, it threatens. Still not sure as we record this, whether it's going to go through. We think, we've got beyond it, but, it threatened to derail the whole thing. And even other experts and solicitors and the planners themselves seem to have opinions that would be in contradiction to what I believe to be the law or the way that the law should be applied. But I'm also aware that I'm not an expert, and from their point of view, from their perspective, they think I'm potentially wrong, and it is confusing. And I someone who's been doing this for a long time, I'm often left confused. Lots of members in our community, the questions around Article 4 and planning permission and status, certificate of lawfulness, this sort of stuff comes up all the time. And the common thread is nobody really seems to know with absolute confidence, what the hand that they're holding really, is going to get them. So before we dive into some of the detail, Martin, how big a problem has this become now certainly in your eyes? You're a gamekeeper turned poacher now. I'm seeing more and more of it, but in your eyes, how much of this issue with planning permission and Article 4 directions and the council's almost appetite to disrupt what's happening in the HMO market, how big a problem is this becoming, do you think?
It's becoming a huge problem. I think it's got to the point now that no real professional HMO landlord can afford not to really understand the basics when it comes to planning. In the past, it wasn't an issue, I think. Before 2010, there was no such thing as C4 and therefore no risk from Article 4 directions. And although you technically needed planning permission for bigger HMOs, more than 6 people, councils didn't care. They didn't do anything. So if you took a house, maybe it was a big house or had been extended or whatever, and you put 8 or 10 people in, nobody cared. And planners like me in the business working in councils didn't even really know, how it all worked because it just wasn't an issue. I do a lot of appeals, and the number of appeals being considered relating to HMOs every year is up by about 10 times since 2010. Wow. So it's a massive increase.
Do you think that that increase is as a direct result of the council's increased appetite to kind of throw this spanner in the works for landlords, or is this more just more HMOs being brought to the market, or people trying to bring more, or is it a combination of it all?
Well, I think it's a combination of everything. So there's been a massive increase in the number of HMOs. It's now a very popular kind of investment class. And alongside that, councils are taking action where they wouldn't before. And also the whole kind of introduction of the C4 use class, which is smaller HMOs, and the introduction of Article 4s means that some HMOs need permission where they didn't before. So those are falling foul of the system. So they're really those three kind of factors.
So I think already we're at risk of confusing.
It's getting complicated.
Some of our listeners who, we're talking about C4 sui generis and Article 4 directions. So I think any opportunity we can, and certainly from somebody sitting in your seat, who we can trust. Can you give us the basics? Just some of the lingo that we really need. We all need to know and understand, Martin, because there's still a lot of confusion around this.
No problem. Well, the very basic is that development needs planning permission. So if you're carrying out a development, you normally need planning permission. And then the next thing to realize is that changing the use of a building or of land is a form of development. So you have different uses, and if you change from one to the other, you may need planning permission. When it comes to HMOs, there are three key uses. The first is C3. Now, C3 is a single family dwelling house. That's the bog standard house or flat, of which there are millions in this country, occupied by a single person or a couple or a family, just the standard property. That's C3. C4 is a HMO with between 3 and 6 residents. We call it a smaller HMO. And sui generis is the third, and that is any more than 6 residents. So if you have a flat or a house and it's rented to a family or occupied by a family or a couple or a single person, that's a standard C3 dwelling. If you've rented it to 3, 4, 5, 6 people, it's a smaller HMO, and that's use class C4. And if you've rented it to 7, 8, 9, 10 plus people, you're into the sui generis class and you have a larger HMO. So there are two types of HMO, 3 different types of dwelling, really.
And so C3 to C4, that needs planning permission. But let's come back to the fact that in most cases that should be permitted, but there are now, restrictions because of Article 4 directions. Let's return to that point. But C3 to C4 typically needs planning permission. And then C4 to sui generis also needs planning permission, does it, Martin?
Yeah, so C3 to sui generis always needs planning permission.
Yep.
That's the simplest lesson. C4 to sui generis always needs planning permission. C3 to C4 is permitted development in a lot of the country. So it's development, but it's permitted through national legislation. So you don't need full planning permission there. Unless, of course, there's an Article 4, which we can come up to. So you generally need planning permission. C3 to C4, i.e. a smaller HMO with 3 to 6 people, that's permitted development unless your local council has taken away that permitted development right through an Article 4 direction.
I've got a very specific question that I want to ask you specifically, and that is about whether one should go from C3 straight to sui generis or C3 to C4, establish the use of C4, and then apply for sui generis. But can we come back to that question, Martin?
Yeah.
Because I think before we do that, let's clear up Article 4, because not everybody operates in an area where there's an Article 4 direction. It's being seemingly rolled out more and more across the country. It's being enforced more and more rigorously, and of course it's becoming more and more front of mind for a lot of people. So can you tell us and explain what an Article 4 direction is and why we need to be aware and bothered and concerned by it?
Right. Well, an Article 4, it doesn't just relate to HMOs. It's a wider concept in planning. So if there are certain things you can do without needing planning permission, and they are called permitted development. I think most people have heard of this idea. You can extend your house or do kind of small things without needing full planning permission to cut red tape. If a council is concerned that there's something special about their area that means that permitted development right shouldn't be allowed, they can introduce what is called an Article 4 direction, which removes that permitted development right in a limited area. Well, it could be their whole district, but in a geographic area. So it's meant to be used relatively rarely in exceptional circumstances. But for example, near me here, there is a conservation area where houses are protected. There's one street where the houses have some kind of really attractive blue wash paint thing. It's historic, it's of historic interest. So there's an Article 4 direction that protects the paint on those houses. You can't repaint them. It's not permitted development to repaint them. You need planning permission to repaint them. So that's an example of an Article 4 direction. Merton Council in London has an Article 4 direction just for the period of the Wimbledon tennis championships every year to stop you putting up a marquee. Because putting up a marquee for a month is permitted development in your garden because you might be having a wedding or something. But they don't want all of the residents of Wimbledon doing it to make money during the Wimbledon championships. So an Article 4 can be quite specific, and it should relate to a particular problem or a particular situation, a particular area. So when the new C4 use was created, which meant in 2010, which meant that you needed planning permission, but it's permitted development, some councils thought, well, we'll use this Article 4 power because our area has so many HMOs, it's such a big problem, we'll take away the right to create smaller HMOs.
Was that predominantly in areas where there were a very high population of student properties, Martin? Or has it been led by the student housing, population?
Yes, I think initially it was the areas with a high number of students around universities. But recently it's spread. Yeah. So it's really university areas and big cities, I think are the main two. So a lot of London boroughs, for example, have them, but also university towns like Brighton or Nottingham or whatever. So an Article 4 just takes away your permitted development rights, which means you can't create your smaller HMO with 3 to 6 people. And it creates these insane outcomes. If you have a guy and a girl living together, 2 people in a 2-bedroom flat, unrelated, say they're friends or flatmates or whatever, and she has a baby, for example, there are now 3 people living in that flat in 2 separate households, and a smaller HMO has been created, even though she's just had a baby. That's all that's happened. So the Article 4 taking away C4, so taking away this permitted development right to create a smaller HMO has all sorts of effects, because if you live in a flat with your girlfriend or your partner, and then you rent out this, actually lodgers may be exempt. If you rent a flat to a couple, and they sublet the spare room to a lodger, there are 3 people in that flat in 2 separate households, and that is the definition of a HMO. If you're in an Article 4 area, you're in breach of planning control. Now, in practice, nothing's going to happen. The council won't bother, but they could if they wanted to.
So the detail of that, and also, that for a lot of people would be incredibly easy to breach, because they just, first of all, wouldn't have a clue, and secondly, it's not being done to monetize anything. It's not been done as an investment purpose, which obviously you and I sat here, we're talking about HMOs largely from an investment perspective, but actually this affects normal non-investment individuals all over the country as well, who can sort of fall into this issue completely by accident.
You could be a couple in a little flat and you know nothing about planning, you just own your flat, and maybe you get sent abroad for work for a year, and you think, well, I'll rent out the flat for a year, and you look up and think, well, all the demand in this area is from the university down the road, and you rent to 3 students, and you've created a smaller HMO. If it's an Article 4 direction, you're in breach of planning. And in some university towns that are hot on that, they're on it. And if it's reported to the council, they'll take action. But all you've done is, you've gone away for a year and you've rented out your flat. And who else? 3 students, why not? So there is that at the bottom end, because 3 people in 2 or more households is a HMO. At that end, I think people get caught out. Okay. But landlords get caught out all the time. But I do feel sorry for people who are just, not professional landlords.
So we've bottomed out the definition of the housing classes, C3, C4, sui generis, that we're concerned with. And now we understand what an Article 4 direction is. One of the confusions I see again and again and again and again in different places, including from agents, from solicitors, and from investors, prospective investors, is the confusion between a HMO license and planning classes. My understanding is that the planning class is completely separate to the HMO license, and just because one has a HMO license or has been applied and even been granted a HMO license, it doesn't change or determine the planning class whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the reason this often comes up is because we see a lot of people trying to buy an Article 4 directions, knowing that they're buying something that's being used as a HMO, and trying to suggest that the presence of a HMO license is almost, by definition, means it's a HMO. But of course, that's not the case, is it, Martin?
No. So HMOs may need a license, but they may also need planning permission. And they are both departments of the council, and it comes as a great surprise to people to learn that those departments are totally separate. They don't talk to each other. They've no interest in each other. They've no idea how each other's operations work. I mean, I don't know anything really about licensing. So they're entirely separate. It's no kind of indication. If you have a HMO license for 8 people in your house, that does not mean it is lawfully a sui generis larger HMO. You could still require planning permission. And in fact, it might be nowadays, it could be the acquisition of the license that tips off the planners. In the old days, they didn't. I mean, there was so little communication between the departments that you could get a license safely without the licensing people telling the planners or whatever. Now, it's common for if they've started to join up their services or their data, their databases, that it could be the license that triggers a planning enforcement investigation. But the fact that you have a license, or the fact that you're buying a property that's licensed, has always been licensed, is entirely irrelevant from a planning point of view.
So I think that for our listeners is a big takeaway, because there's still so much confusion around that. I've been scribbling notes, Martin, as we go. I said before we record, I've got lots of questions I want to ask you, and as we've already been talking, more have come out, and I'm just scribbling these down as we speak. There's more and more stuff, but that's great. So we've bottomed out different planning classes. We now understand what Article 4 directions mean, and we understand that the difference between Article 4 directions and HMO licensing, and how they're in fact completely separate. Yeah. And you've also said that this is now becoming a massive issue across the country. I'm experiencing that. Lots of people are. And I agree with you, Martin. I don't think that landlords, HMO investors can move forwards without a huge degree of risk, without really and completely understanding all of this now. I've been enforced before. Right. Currently, as I said, I've got issues with my soliciting, and the fact that they're confused about the legalities and some of the terms and the meanings and definitions. And I know a lot of people in different parts of the country, in different counties, different authorities, who are being almost seemingly intentionally targeted by some of the broad terms of what can and can't be done under Article 4 directions, as councils enforce them for the first time. So if I give you an example, Martin, Liverpool is a big city, as we know, a huge population of students, and for an unusual reason, until recently didn't actually have an Article 4 direction. They've recently introduced that Article 4 direction. And in doing so, while sort of enforcing that and bringing that into enforcement, they have put almost a complete block on any development, on anything within the Article 4 direction. I'm working with a few people who are working incredibly hard with a planning consultant with a special interest in HMOs, similar to yourself, gamekeeper turned poacher, and hitting a brick wall with the authority. Even if they didn't want to change the number of bedrooms, they are resisting any attempt to do an extension, which you and I would have thought was under a permitted development right. Maybe put a rear dormer on, which again in most cases would be a permitted development right. Is this you're something aware of that's happening around the country? Is this something that the authorities can legally do? It doesn't make sense to me. I can't understand how an Article 4 direction that limits the restriction of C3 to C4 can also prevent investors from extending their homes or making certain adjustments that were otherwise permitted.
No, you're right. It shouldn't really. It's possible there's another Article 4 restricting extensions in some way, but it's more likely that Liverpool are deciding that HMOs don't benefit from householder permitted development rights and therefore can't extend in the same way. That is controversial, and there's a fair bit of case law to say that actually HMOs are houses, they're dwellings, and therefore they benefit from the same householder permitted development rights. There's another issue if you extend in a way that changes the use class. So if you have a 3-bedroom house rented to 4 sharers for example, and it's a C4 smaller HMO, and then you do a loft conversion and a ground floor rear extension and a side extension, whatever, and you take it up to 7 people, then you've changed the use to a larger HMO, sui generis, and that change of use needs planning permission. But if it's the case that you have a 3-bedroom house and you're trying to extend it to make it a 6-person house, that's still within C4, and they shouldn't resist that.
So what we're finding on the ground is that certain local authorities are resisting it and making it incredibly difficult and letting lots and lots and lots of applications go through to an appeals process. Right. And it seems to me that, and certainly the reports that we've had back from the experts, is that there really is no reasonable justification for this. They haven't introduced a separate direction limiting the other permitted development rights like extensions and rear dormers. But it does seem to be that the council trying as best as possible to make it incredibly difficult for investors, quite simply and quite literally to slow the process down, to make it expensive, to make it hard work, to almost get investors to reconsider whether they can be bothered to do this. Really trying to reduce the appetite for investing in HMOs. And, that's certainly what myself and people I work with and a lot of my community are experiencing. And there is now a huge, battle happening in lots of authorities between investors and the enforcement of the way that the Article 4 directions are being enforced. So I suppose if I give you a scenario, Martin, and I think that these are the sorts of issues that people are having. First of all, I think let's talk about making sure that we're kind of steadfast. If we're going to buy something, talk about what we need. If we're going to buy something existing or buy something that we plan to convert. But also, I'd like to give you a couple of examples of purchases where the council have resisted and certain things like density thresholds have come into play, and considerations around the density and what's allowed and what's not in certain case laws. But before we do the latter, the first question then, what do we need to be aware of as an investor? What do we need to be making sure that we've got in our back pocket if we're buying a property that we want to use as a HMO now, Martin?
Well, if I were buying a standard house that I intended to turn into a HMO, the first thing to check is whether there's an Article 4. So that's by far the most important point, or whether there's one coming. If you're not in an Article 4 area, you can create a HMO with up to 6 people without needing planning permission. And you can extend the house using normal permitted development rights, usually. So for the first thing to check is it an Article 4 area? If it is, and it's a bog standard house you want to convert into a HMO, you need to look into the planning policies and work out if you might get planning permission. However, if the council have gone to the trouble of bringing in an Article 4, they've probably also brought in planning policies to say that you can't convert to C4, because otherwise what's the point? You would just get around the Article 4 by applying for planning permission. So basically, it's a very, very basic rule of thumb, but if there's an Article 4, you're probably done for in terms of getting your smaller HMO. So the answer then, of course, is try and buy one that's already there and lawful. So a C4 smaller HMO, even if there's an Article 4, is lawful if the use started before the Article 4 came into effect. It's also lawful if the use started more than 10 years ago. That's the 10-year rule for any change of use. An unlawful change of use becomes lawful after 10 years of continuous activity. So if you're looking at a HMO that's for sale, for example, and it's an Article 4 area and they don't have any paperwork, we'll say in planning, you could say to the seller, when did you start this HMO? Was it before the Article 4 came in? And if not, was it 10 years before today's date? And if they say, oh, yeah, I've been running this for 10 years, I've all the tenancy agreements, I've bank statements showing evidence, blah, blah, blah. I've had HMO licenses, I've had I've got my letting agent has all of their records. You've loads of evidence, then you can get around it that way. You can apply for what's called a certificate of lawfulness and show that your HMO is lawful by virtue of that passage of time. So that's one option. Alternatively, you can apply for planning permission. But for that, you're best to get a planning consultant to look at the local policies and work out what the situation is. Some councils have very strict, powerful policies that are up to date that say no HMOs. Newham Council in London, no HMOs of any kind. And if you look at their appeal success rate, it's very, very high. Other councils have wishy-washy policies and are not as strong or out of date or whatever. So a consultant will tell you where you stand on that.
So there really is no standard across the country as to whether or not you're going to get the approval for a new HMO within an Article 4 direction. It's completely different depending where that is. Every policy, every authority will have its own policy.
Exactly.
In Sheffield, for example, the density threshold they use, amongst some other policies, is a 20%. So if there are more than 20% HMOs on a street or within a certain radius, they will automatically refuse it. Now, I work with a lot of people in the industry, and a lot of people who have very, very, very big portfolios into the hundreds of properties that they own. Right. And so they have a bit more clout and have challenged the council on a number of occasions, and in some occasions won, only for the council to go back and then change their policy afterwards once they've lost an appeal. So, for example, where there are lots of student HMOs, I think there's sense in saying no more, because otherwise you do make it incredibly tough for residents who happen to live there, as this all happened around them. And so I'm not completely against that. But then at the same time, when you've got something like 70 or 80% of the houses being HMOs on the street, then almost by definition, that is the norm there. Yeah. And, it's normal residents and anything else would be almost unusual there. And so they've won some by almost proving that would be the case. So there've been more than 80% on the street are HMOs. So actually, you really, what argument have you got to give us to say that this isn't in keeping and actually that this is going to materially change the area? Is that something that you're aware of that's happening? And is there a legitimate case? Is it risky to kind of build your house on that foundation, Martin? What do you think?
Yeah, well, the first thing, of course, is that planning is so uncertain that it's always risky. So the difficulty you have is that if you've seen a nice property on Rightmove and you want to buy it, it's hard to get the seller to wait 6 months while you apply and appeal and all that palaver. So that's the first problem. I mean, the very fact of having to go through an appeal for most people is just not practical. For developers, it's not practical because they don't have the time and that. But you're right, that is one. The policies relating to concentration are quite common. So for example, Portsmouth says no more than 10% of the properties within a 50-meter radius of the site can be HMOs, and they apply that. Now, generally speaking, at appeal, inspectors support that approach because it's been adopted, it's gone through public consultation. If they kind of just walk all over it, it ceases to have any effect. So they support it, but with inspectors, you can sometimes persuade them if you have some kind of argument. So with the council, and I was a case officer, so I was the same. If you have some guidance, written guidance, you stick to it like glue because it's the easiest way to decide applications. If the council doesn't really like HMOs and they have this concentration, 10%, 20% thing, and a HMO application comes in and it breaches the 20%, you're just going to say no. Why put your neck out and think, well, maybe we can make an exception here? So that's why councils refuse it. But the appeal inspector has total freedom. The appeal inspector can look at it and go, right, what is the appellant saying? What is the real situation here? What's it like on the street? What's the right outcome? Taking into account, giving huge weight to the policies, but taking into account everything else. So most appeals I do generally in planning are because, especially the smaller stuff, the householder stuff, is the council have stuck rigidly to some bit of policy and they've done that too hard, I guess. So I wrote a report today. Somebody was applying for a dormer extension to the back of their house. the council's guidance says it should be half the size of the roof, but every other house on the street had a full-size dormer. So the council officer said, no, you're not complying with our guidance. But it's an absurd outcome because every other house, what's the harm? It would look ridiculous to be set in. So that's kind of a bit of an aside, but that's often how my appeals work. So going back to HMOs, I have seen appeal decisions where inspectors have said, okay, you're way above the 20% or 10% concentration, and in fact you're so far above it that this area is now characterised by HMOs.
Okay.
And if we leave it as a family house, it's blighted because families don't want to live here.
So it's not a complete death sentence, but it's certainly by no means a guarantee, and probably unlikely. You'd want to be pretty confident if you're going to take the council on, knowing that there is certainly a significant density or concentration there that gives you some sort of an argument to construct a case around.
I mean, the great thing about a planning consultant is what they can do is read the policies and come up to a professional view as to how strong they are, how clearly worded they are, because sometimes they're ambiguous. And then look at decisions, look at how those policies have been treated at appeal stage or even by the council. And, so sometimes I'll do a review of appeal decisions in Bristol or something, and I'll find that actually lots are getting through. And you'll see the inspectors are saying, well, actually, this guidance is out of date, or they've phrased it oddly, or whatever, or this area is so has so many HMOs, it's no longer a problem. And then your consultant can report back and say, look, in the real world, this is how HMO applications in this borough or in this district are doing.
Martin, go back to something we talked about earlier. We talked about getting the historic, or being able to demonstrate the historic use. So if you're going to buy something existing, which I often do, getting hold of that evidence. I've been doing that for years and years and years. And in areas like Sheffield, they wanted us to go back as far as 2011, when the Article 4 direction came into force here. That, over the years, has been so challenging and so tough and so frustrating to collect all of the evidence. And I would say probably, about 33% of the time, we got what we needed. The remainder of the offers, we had properties, we'd offered on, they'd accepted them. We always, we'd say our offer is subject to you producing that evidence because we need to be able to demonstrate that this property is compliant from a planning perspective, and then there's stuff missing inevitably because landlords, not all landlords are the best record keepers. Things go missing, agents go bust, and I know a lot of people struggle with this as well. And it's a question that comes up in the community regularly. What do we need? How solid does that evidence need? How many gaps and holes can we reasonably have? How much risk is there if there are some years of paperwork missing? Which, in my experience, if you're going back several years, is almost always the case.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. Well, when I worked in councils, 2013 and before, we at least in my experience took a fairly relaxed approach to these kinds of applications. We looked at the evidence. And we thought the correct test is the balance of probabilities. We thought, what is more likely here? Are they telling us the truth? Does it more or less add up? And we tended to approve them, to be honest. In recent years, it's become much, much tougher. They have the culture, the approach to these type of applications has flipped over to we must have almost flawless evidence, which isn't really how it's meant to work and is also just way too demanding. There's also great confusion in councils about what you need. I find case officers ringing me up and saying, well, we can't approve this because there's no bank statements or something. And you say, well, we don't have to produce any particular type of evidence. We just need to paint a complete picture. A bit can be missing.
So this is planners in the planning department. They themselves confused about what they need to approve applications. So that is how confused this subject is on all levels.
Well, the issue is that there's no hard and fast rule. All you have to, the decision maker has the authority. They decide, the case officer, or if you're at appeal, the inspector, and they come up with a judgment about whether you have demonstrated on the balance of probabilities that what you're claiming is true. And, so there's a whole wide spectrum there of someone who's quite lax or generous and someone who's very, very strict and says, well, for 2 months in 2017, we're missing a bit of a bank statement or whatever. So the other problem with HMOs, of course, is that if you have a 10-bedroom HMO, and the tenants leave every 6 months. You have hundreds of tenancy agreements. So, and records and people. And, so I say to clients, I do a lot of these applications. I say to clients, can you back through your emails and find an email from a tenant complaining about a maintenance issue or saying they're leaving or whatever, saying they'll let the gas safety inspector person in or whatever, because that shows, that person was living there, and then you can cross-reference that with their tenancy agreement and their rent coming in and their deposit protection and everything. And they say, well, I've got hundreds of emails. How could I possibly? So, the big question is, how much evidence do you produce? A landlord with good record keeping, somebody very assiduous who's got tons and tons of records. You can. It would take me a week to submit everything through that planning portal if we were doing it. So it's a judgment call about how much you need. You need to pare it down. A lot of the evidence people present to me is just weak, so there are things you need to be careful of. Tenancy agreements need to have the address of the property and ideally the room. There's no point. It can't be it can't be possible that it's for one of your other properties. You can't just produce bank statements showing loads of rent come in. Really, it needs to have the surname and the room and the postcode or something, so that you can cross-reference the details and so that you can be sure that it does refer to a particular property. But the key is to triangulate evidence. You have one piece, say a tenancy agreement for Mr. Smith, then there's a bank statement showing rent coming in from Mr. Smith, then you have a letter Mr. Smith received at his address, then you have an email from him confirming he lived there. Because one piece of evidence can be forged or whatever, but if you have several corroborating bits, that's what they like to see.
That's interesting, and actually more than I thought we even needed. I've always thought that the tenancy agreements are pretty much the be all and end all, but actually now, I think I'll try and get more to, like you say, triangulate that and support it. And I've been enforced more than once. I've been enforced on different things as well. I've been enforced on C4.
Right.
I've been enforced on things like dormers as well, and exactly like the example you gave earlier. We did a rear dormer under PD, and it was a particular size, and then someone literally knocked on the door, actually came up to the office and said that this was an issue, and it's too big, and anyway, so okay, that's really interesting, and I think incredibly important for any of our listeners who are considering buying an existing HMO. Of course, if you're not buying an existing HMO, you've got to think about whether or not you're likely to get this planning, whether you're likely to get C4 or sui generis, irrespective, and that's a very different consideration. So one of the questions I wanted to ask then is, why are the local authorities allowed to do this, Martin? Why are they allowed to introduce Article 4 directions? In my opinion, a lot of this is an anti-student policy. There's in cities like Sheffield and Nottingham and Liverpool, it seems incredibly obvious to me that this is an anti-student policy. And there's no way that you could have an anti-community policy of any other community type or tenant demographic or race, culture. This to me is almost all this is. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, that's interesting. First thing I wanted to say is that I think the Article 4s are often counterproductive, because the way, in the absence of an Article 4, you can go from a family house to a shared up to 6 people house and back again. So you might be a landlord who puts it on the market one year, a family comes, great, you can have it. Then the next year the family leaves and 4 sharers come, great, you can have it. Then the following year it's a family again. That's the point of the flexibility. That's why C3 to C4 is permitted development. If you're in Liverpool or somewhere and there's an Article 4 and you luckily had tenants in there, 4 sharers in there when it came in, the Article 4, you now have a lawful C4 smaller HMO. You will never let a family live there because you will lose your smaller HMO status. You have to forever rent to between 3 and 6 people to maintain your smaller HMO, and that smaller HMO will be more valuable than a family home because it's in an area with an Article 4 and the supply of HMOs is being strangled from then on. So it's actually, ironically, it may be stopping new HMOs being created, but it's also meaning that a landlord who has one will never give it up. So the flexibility that you might move as the market dictates, because in future maybe HMOs aren't as attractive or whatever, that flexibility is gone. So there's that issue. You asked about why they're allowed to do it. Like, councils have kind of cleverly found that Article 4 works for this kind of thing. I'm not sure it was ever envisaged that this would be a clever way to limit the spread of HMOs. And initially the government was trying to limit HMOs, or at least regulate them by introducing tougher licensing and stuff like that. The way councils kind of work, council planning departments are a little bit Wild West. They develop a culture. There are things they just don't like. And they have their policies, but there are also things they just, when an application comes in for a certain type of development they're not fond of, they like to find a way to refuse it. And they like to find a way to resist it, whatever the merits of the case. And there's just hostility now to HMOs. That's the issue. And it's partly because they've become so popular, they've spread so much. It's partly because some HMOs are badly managed. I mean, you and I know there are landlords out there who don't do a good job, and there's rubbish in the front garden and antisocial behaviour and all of that. So it's partly political because local residents don't like them and so on. The government this year revised the National Planning Guidance, the National Planning Policy Framework, to say that Article 4, to make it harder for councils to introduce Article 4s. So Article 4s always need the approval of the Secretary of State, but now they have to be, it's just the wording is clearer to say that they must be absolutely necessary to solve a clearly identified problem, and they must apply to the smallest possible geographic area and so on. So there's some hope that it'll be harder for councils to introduce Article 4s without very good grounds, at least.
So that presents, I'll probably tease me up for a question I've been dying to ask you, which is what the future of Article 4 looks like. But before we do, I think there's a really important piece to highlight there that you touched on. If you've got a HMO and you've got established use and you revert to using it as a normal residential dwelling, so under 3 individuals, or not using it within the definition of a HMO, you automatically lose your planning status. It reverts to C3, and then you can't just get it back. You've got to, if it's in an Article 4 direction, you've got to go back through the planning system to try and get that. And then, of course, the likelihood is you're going to find that very difficult to get.
Yes. So you do need to be very careful on this stuff. If your C4 is lawful because it predates an Article 4, then it's lawful because you created it through permitted development. You changed the use. Now, the Article 4 stops you going from C3, a dwelling, to C4, a HMO, but it probably doesn't stop you going back again. So if you rent to a family, you've exercised a permitted development right to permanently change the use of your property from C4 to C3. And then a year later, if that family moves out and you think, well, I'll put shares back in, you have a C3 in an Article 4 area, and you can't just assume there's no permitted development right to go back to C4. So it's a thing in planning that's very poorly understood. A use is not a label that sits forever with a property. If you have a lawful C4 and you change that use by your actions, by moving other people in, then you've changed the use. The previous use is gone. You can't just go back to it automatically. You can't. It's a bit complicated, and you can in some circumstances. And it helps if you've had full planning rather than a permitted development route. But you can't assume, at least, that you can just bounce back into the previous use.
For a lot of landlords, it sometimes is a sensible thing to do. You might have a property, you've got tenants in, or it was a property that had tenants in, and actually you want to get in and do a refurbishment. Particularly landlords in the student cycle, they like to keep a property in the student cycle. And if you buy something or need to do some work, you need to turf the tenants out. You've got to dedicate an amount of time to doing some refurbishment work. So let's say you spend 3-4 months doing that. And then you could let that house out, just to bridge the gap until the next academic cycle, till you get students in again. But unless you use it as a HMO and let it to, which is difficult, because at what point can you put 1 or 2 individuals in before, if 1 or 2 individuals move in before a third one, does that, have you lost your continuous use? It's very tricky. And so I think for a lot of landlords, myself included, we would rent to a small group for a short period if we found them, but we certainly wouldn't risk letting it out to a couple, for example, on a single tenancy. We would just be too afraid that it could come back and bite us at some point in the future. Maybe we'd never get enforced. Maybe the mortgage lender would never know or even be bothered. But maybe if we needed to sell it in 5 or 10 years' time, maybe it would present a problem then, because we wouldn't have the continuous use record. Is this something for us to really be aware of, Martin, and to tread carefully with?
It's something to be very careful about. And the other thing that I often come across is where people have jumped between, say, 6 residents and 7, because they're 2 different uses. 3 to 6 is smaller HMO C4. 7 or more is sui generis. So I have clients in London, for example, who come to me and say, I've had my HMO for 10 years now. I've been waiting for this wonderful day to come. I want to apply for a certificate of lawfulness. Here's all my evidence. It's lawful because 10 years have passed, the 10-year rule. And I look at the evidence and I say, well, what you have here is a 5-bedroom house. And in 2016, you had a couple in that room and a couple in that room, and you had 7 people. And in 2015, you'd only 6 people. And in 2019, you'd 4 people, and so on. And what they've done is they've changed the use. So they haven't got 10 years use they've 10 years use as a HMO technically. But in planning terms, they've had a few years use as a C4 smaller HMO. Then they've gone up to 7 residents. So they've inadvertently changed the use to a larger HMO, losing resetting the 10-year clock because they've changed the use. Then they've gone back to 6 because they rented to a single person rather than a couple. So that kind of thing comes up quite a bit. You just need to be careful that they are 3 different uses, and people can be quite casual. They can say, well, okay, I get that they're 2 different uses, but it doesn't really matter if 1 extra person is in there or whatever. It does if it goes from 6 to 7.
Okay, so I mean, you're constructing a very, very clear case for anybody who's tackling or getting involved with buying something or having to combat some issues around planning permission for their Article 4, to get a planning consultant, because this is not black and white stuff. It's clearly not black and white on anybody's side, and is really the implications of not getting it right and not approaching it in the right way could be massive, and particularly now with Article 4's putting HMOs at a premium, and we're paying more and more and more for them, well above bricks and mortar value. If we get it wrong, we could very much be lumped with something that actually we can't legally use in a particular way, then doesn't have the value, and then it's probably sandwiched amongst many HMOs that really isn't that attractive to the residential market, and in some ways we could be a little bit almost landlocked, with this property, and because there isn't an obvious alternative or a way to recoup any loss that you might have made in it. So the implications here of not getting this right are huge, aren't they, Martin?
Yeah, and some people, really suffer financially, because in one way you can say, well, hold on, is it that big a deal? You've got a 3-bedroom house, you were renting it to students or whatever, and the Council of Comment told you can't, and now you have to rent it to a family. You're not going to be ruined by that. But I have clients who have bought a house, doubled its size through permitted development extensions, reconfigured it internally in a HMO style, so maybe with 8 ensuite bedrooms, we'll say, or something, and a giant kitchen in an industrial style, but the style. And then the council have come and said, well, no, we're not allowing any of this. You can put a family in there and that's all. I mean, what family will rent your 8 ensuite bedroom HMO? It's just not configured. And they might have spent in London 200,000 or 300,000 or more extending and configuring that. So I have clients like that, and that kind of thing is ruinous, So one does need to be careful, but I don't want to be entirely negative. It's not all bad news. And I think what's happening is that the sector is transitioning, and this is what the government wants. I think this is partly what's behind it all. The sector is transitioning to becoming more professional, as is all of the private rental sector, with tenancy deposit protection and all of the different rules coming in. And as professional landlords, we have to move with that transition. We have to professionalize, and we have to accept that we have to spend money on things. And one of the things we need to spend money on, and I say this with self-interest, is planning consultants. And a little bit of money will buy a little bit of advice that can solve a big problem. Because a lot of this stuff, as a consultant, I know how it all works through my experience, and I can answer a question maybe in 10 minutes, but that question answered saves someone a lot of money, and just answers a problem that they were Googling for hours or whatever. So it's a good idea to find a good consultant who knows about HMOs, is interested in HMOs, and then for a small amount of money, I would imagine, you can hire them just to solve little problems that come up.
I have got these two questions then that I'm burning to ask you that I want to circle back round to. The first one is around going from C4 to sui generis, and the second one is about what you think the future of Article 4 directions looks like for us, for investors. So first of all then, I've got a property. It's a house that I bought, and it was used as residential, normal house, no Article 4 direction. I converted it under PD and have used it as a HMO, and have a license for 6 and have let it to 6. If I wanted to let that to 7 moving forwards, in fact, the license interestingly permits 7, but I don't have planning for 7. If I wanted to put 7 in now, Martin, I'd obviously need to apply for planning permission. I've got some friends who buy properties, and let's hypothetically look at a similar example, but somebody who wants to buy a house next door, or maybe in another town. They want to go straight from C3 to sui generis. They want to go straight from to a 7 bed. Is there a better way to do this? My understanding is it's probably better to try and establish the use as C4 and then go and try and get a non-material change of use, which still requires planning, from C4 to sui generis. Or does that matter? Is this a myth? Am I telling people the wrong advice?
It's a very interesting question, and in a way, it's the holy grail. We all want. Well, I don't have HMOs myself, but we all want, I imagine, the more rooms, the better. The better the yield and everything. And the larger HMOs are what the councils are most concerned about, because they have more occupancy and more noise and more activity and so on. The first thing to check with a sui generis is whether or not you might actually just get planning permission. So we're all, and I mean, the way I've been talking today, we're all programmed to think, well, if you need planning permission, screw it, find a different way, find a trick. But actually, the planning system, the fact that you need it doesn't mean you won't get it. And that's true of Article 4 things as well. So the first thing I would do, if I was in a particular town looking at your particular HMO there, I would check what the policy is. Now, if the local policy says, we hate sui generis HMOs, we will never allow them, and we've backed it up in this way, and so on, then you will have to go to some kind of plan B. But it's perfectly possible that they will grant it. And as you were saying, you've a few things that help in that particular case. If you have a lawful C4 HMO with 6 residents, and you're adding one more, then it's hard for the council to say that there's much harm. Because if 6 is okay, what's the extra person going to do? Are they going to suddenly cause a load of parking problems, a load of extra rubbish, wake the neighbours up at night, or whatever? No.
Because it's just one extra person.
Because this is one extra person. And you can have the description, the planning permission could be granted for a 7-person HMO. So just having 7 doesn't mean you can then run to 8. You would need a further planning permission or a variation of your permission. So the first thing is the just one extra resident trick, I guess, where you could incrementally try and increase it. Now, that doesn't work if the council has very strong policies against it. But at appeal, it would be hard for them to win, because, it's all very well to have a policy, but you have to show harm. You can't have a policy that says we will not allow large HMOs, because that means that's ridiculous. There has to be harm. You have to identify harm. So if you apply and you can show that, okay, you have this policy, but there will be no harm from my extra resident, then you have a good chance of success. So establishing the C4 is definitely a good start, because then you're not leaping from a family house to a sui generis, which is quite a big change in the character of the building. You're leaping from 6 shares to 7.
So that, for a lot of people, then, I think will be an important point and a key takeaway from today's podcast, because a lot of people are creating large HMOs, some within Article 4 directions, some outside. But this point, I think, applies irrespective, Article 4 direction or not. And it's a question, again, that comes up a lot. And I know a lot of people who have tried to go from C3 straight to sui generis have come up against a huge amount of resistance. And in my experience, certainly personally, and a lot of people that I've worked with, there has seemingly been a slightly easier route to that permission by going from C3 to C4, establishing the use, getting it up and running, and then getting that application in for the 7th room. And of course, it takes a little bit longer. You might have to delay some profits. It might be an obstruction with a refinance plan. But I
Yeah.
think in the grand scheme of things, it would make sense to me
Yes.
to try and reduce the risk of getting, knocked
Yes.
back on this as much as possible.
But the only word of caution I would add is that there's no need to go through all of that unless you need to. So I wouldn't do it as a reflex or automatically. I would check whether it's necessary. So, for example, some councils have policies that say they want to protect family dwellings, so they won't allow a family house to be converted. Now, in that case, if you've already used your PD rights or some other mechanism to get a C4, you've already converted it, you've already lost the family dwelling. So that policy falls away. So the strategy you've just outlined works well there. So if it's so you need to just work out if that strategy is necessary. Because if the council doesn't have strong policies, you can go straight to sui generis.
You don't need it.
You don't need
So
it.
how on earth would I know that? I wouldn't have a clue, where to look, for this sort of detail. Is this really where is this where the planning consultant comes in, the expert, Martin, or
Yes.
because it's well and good you saying, look at the policy, but actually, I wouldn't even have a clue where to look. I probably wouldn't even really know how to interpret what I do find. And I've read these documents before, and often just kind of hold my hands up and haven't got a clue. Really. Is that a technical matter? Is that something that really needs to be interpreted by somebody who knows what they're reading?
Well, the planning consultant's the easiest way to do it. But if, planning isn't supposed to be a big mystery. It's supposed to be open to the public. Policies are published on every council's website and are supposed to be readable and so on. My book, I've written a book this year, it came out in July, called How to Get Planning Permission. It's not about HMOs specifically, it's about planning permission in general. But there's a couple of chapters on how to work out what your local council's policies are, how to interpret them, how to understand how they're applied, and so on. So that's a good starting point. But if you are a HMO landlord, professional HMO landlord, and you operate in one or two or three council areas, because I think a lot of landlords just work in Liverpool or wherever, they have their own patch. I think you should become familiar with what's happening planning-wise in that patch. And the first thing to do is look up the local policies for HMOs. And the second thing, which I recommend to all developers of any kind, is to monitor planning applications. So every month, on the last day of the month, I live in Ealing in West London, and it's an area of interest to me. I do a bit of developing here. On the last day of the month, I go into the Ealing Council website and I download a list of all the planning applications that were decided in that month. And I just scan through for anything interesting, because it tells you what other developers are doing, how the council is considering stuff, whatever. So you might spot, wait a minute, that guy's built a house in his garden, and I know that area, maybe another garden could be developed. You learn that way. So I would recommend every month, look at the HMO decisions that have been made. You'll get a sense of what's getting through and what not. You'll see the tricks that they employ. You can read their planning statements by their planning consultants and see what arguments they're using. And every time a planning application is decided, the case officer writes an officer's report that goes on the website. And this is a platinum resource. People don't know about it, but it's the best way to learn about the planning system. When you look at an application that seems interesting, download the officer's report and read what the case officer said, because that's how you learn. That's how, in practice, applications are assessed. The policies are one thing, but it's all about sustainability. It's all about a load of stuff that seems generic and hard to interpret. The stuff that case officers are interested in, and it might be one or two things each time, is in the officer's report.
What a great piece of advice, Martin. I've never done it. I have read, obviously, other applications on the planning site, but I've never done it as a matter of course, as a way of informing myself and kind of building my own thought around this quite complicated, often troublesome subject. Okay, my last question then, Martin, dying to ask you. I think for a long while I've been wondering whether, because I'm seeing more and more come in, I am starting to wonder whether at some point this is just going to be rolled out in such an extent it's almost a blanket policy, or could there be a point at which it triggers a removal of this permitted, because that seems the easiest way to deal with this. If it was a problem that they agreed with at the top, just remove the permitted development right from C3 to C4.
Yeah.
Is there a risk of that happening? Are we going to see more Article 4 directions? Is this going to become more problematic for us? What do you think?
There is a risk of it happening. It happened in Wales. In Wales, you always need planning permission to go from C3 to C4. I think my feeling is that we may be coming close to a kind of a peak. I mean, I think Article 4s will keep spreading, but slowly. But I think a lot of the main ones have happened. The big councils have done them. And it may now settle down, really. I also think they're probably working in terms of what the government and councils are trying to achieve. I think they are limiting the spread of HMOs. And I also think the sector is helping itself a bit by, it is improving. A lot of the dodgier landlords are gone or are going because they're getting thrown off by all the licensing requirements and all of the planning requirements. And that leaves the good ones left, the professional ones. They're acquiring some of the HMOs that are left, or those HMOs are converting to other uses, back to houses or whatever. So I think my kind of expectation is that animosity towards HMOs will settle down. The sector is getting way more professional. You get these really nicely decorated HMOs. Landlords properly take care of their tenants. The demographics aren't changing. People still want to live alone. So there's still demand. So I think, the current situation is probably a bit of a status quo. Hopefully things won't get much worse, but, and maybe not get much better either. But, for a professional landlord, the current situation is manageable.
I think at the same time, certainly my own animosity towards the Article 4 directions from the other side has lessened. Now, actually, it is a double-edged sword. Owning stuff within the Article 4 directions is actually a very good thing. There aren't many businesses in the world that you could set up where there is a limitation on the number of competitors that you can have, and actually that's very favourable if you're thinking about this with a very long-term view, which you should be buying these sorts of assets and doing this. Then actually buying within an Article 4 direction really gives you some shelter. From more and more competition coming in and disrupting and leading to problems like oversaturation. And I do completely agree, actually. I do think that we needed more regulation. I think licensing, actually, would be a better way. Managing the licensing process would be a better way of upkeeping the standard of accommodation and landlordship. And I still think there's a lot of work that they've got to do there to do that. But actually, that's a tick box exercise. And they can do inspections. But yeah, I suppose it's a double-edged sword. And I do feel like, in many ways, I like the Article 4 directions because I like what I've bought there. And they've gone up in value and I'm protected. And I've got incredible rental demand because of that. And there are examples around the country, cities like Coventry and other areas where some landlords, at the expense of new landlords coming in who've done well, but some landlords have been in it a while and invested in good faith and still good landlords, but have just succumbed to the amount of the pressure and the volume of new stock coming on. They've lost out and they've ended up with houses that actually have fallen in value and are costing them money or not earning them as much because there is no restriction on how many can appear and pop up. And I think that itself is a big issue. In some ways, it's great. There's no Article 4 direction there, so you can convert things and there's not as much restriction. But at the same time, the data is very clear in that there are many more people, many more rooms available, relatively speaking to other areas, than there are people looking for those rooms, which is obviously a problem. As a landlord, somebody wants to build a sustainable business. So I think I'm sort of split down the middle. I'm less concerned about Article 4 directions now and almost accept it. And with your advice today, I'm going to try and learn more and understand my local council policies more and more, because I actually do think that I could do more work with trying to buy stuff that is just easy to discard and say, well, the council will never give it me. Because actually, I haven't looked close enough, Martin. I've done some applications, won some, lost some, but actually I think I could get a lot better. So I'm going to go and do that now moving forwards.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's an opportunity as well. If you find properties that are for sale that can't sell because they don't have a license, or sorry, they don't have a certificate of lawfulness or planning permission in an Article 4 area, for example, you can help that landlord. You can buy it and sort out the planning problems, or you can help, so there's an opportunity to buy stuff which has planning problems and to use the planning knowledge you develop to fix them. Because you might find a HMO has been running for 10 years and you can find a way to prove that, and you perhaps buy it at a little bit below market value, fix that problem, and then you have an asset, a better asset.
Yeah, I agree. Martin, one more question has just come to me. If I'm buying an existing HMO, it's got paperwork, but it doesn't have any sort of formal certificate of its status. It doesn't, it's never had a planning permission granted formally. The owner hasn't applied for a certificate for lawful use. So long as I inherit all the paperwork, I, by virtue of that historic and continuous use, actually inherit the planning status, do I? And only unless I was enforced do I need to be concerned about showing anybody anything or producing any paperwork.
So the important thing is the use, not the owner. It doesn't matter who owned it at any time. So the use is all the planners are interested in, and there's no obligation on you to have a certificate. So you can just run it as it is without doing anything further.
That in a nutshell is the issue that I had recently with my solicitors and the planners, and the HMO that I'm trying to purchase, and the planners saying that they don't have a record of it being used as HMO, so I need to apply for planning permission. And my solicitors were about to tell the sellers that they need to go and apply for planning permission. And I was saying, no. We've got the paperwork. We've got the tenancy agreements. We don't need anything. I don't need anything. All we need to do is tell the lender that we've got evidence of the historic use by way of the tenancy agreements, assume that they're going to be happy with it, which so far my experience of doing this for a long time now, lenders have been happy with it. But it's just good to have your kind of calibration on that point, because even when people question me and I question them, and sometimes you do sit just scratching your head wondering whether you've missed something. So it's always good to, I think, to validate these bits and pieces. So for all of our listeners, even I get confused and lost in this sort of stuff, because there are lots of experts and lots of people cooking up this broth, and not everybody really knows exactly what's going on. Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and a fascinating conversation. I could chat about this stuff and probably moan about a lot of stuff for a long time. But actually, I completely agree with what you kicked us off with, which is I don't think that you can invest in HMOs any longer without understanding this, without really knowing the implications and the approach that you need to take when it comes to planning status, Article 4 directions. So thank you for shedding so much light on this. And what I want to do is also tell all of our listeners today that Martin has very kindly done an expert workshop for us inside the HMO roadmap. So all of these sort of topics that we've touched on today, there's a huge amount more detail and information inside the roadmap in the form of a brand new workshop that's going to get launched this month. So I think, did we say the 21st or 22nd, something like that, Martin? Yeah, I think that it's going live in the roadmap. It's an amazing workshop. There's so much valuable information and insight in there. I'm sure that you'll agree that today's episode has produced a lot of that, but this workshop is at a completely different level. And then, of course, keep an eye out for Martin's book. He's already got a book out, but he's got a new book coming out. When is your new book coming out, Martin?
It should be out in February. It's being edited at the moment. It's called Planning for HMOs, directed at HMO landlords and investors. So look out for it in February.
So I think that is going to be on a lot of people's reading lists, because that could be the holy grail for a lot of us in our industry, Martin. So I'm certainly very much looking forward to the launch of that book, and I'll be asking or getting myself a copy of that. Before you disappear, Martin, I'm sure there are a lot of people sitting there thinking, Martin is exactly what I need right now to help me solve the problems that I'm having with either a purchase or an enforcement issue.
Yeah.
How can they reach out? What's the best way to contact you?
Well, I have a page on my website dedicated to HMOs. So that's martingaine.com/HMOs. The planning consultancy, if you want to go there directly, is just-planning.co.uk. And I'm on Instagram with the handle Martin the Planner. So you can find me there.
Thank you, Martin. There you go, guys. So if you need any help at all with a planning issue on your HMOs, then Martin is clearly the guy to go and talk to. So don't hesitate, reach out. I certainly wouldn't hesitate if I was having an issue with any of my HMOs at all. Martin, thank you so much for coming on to the
was a
podcast
pleasure.
today.
Thank
It's
you.
been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'll certainly be looking out for your articles. I know you do a lot of writing for some of the big tabloids as well,
Yeah.
which I think is where I first saw some of your stuff. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy.